What's up, gang? Welcome back to the fanfic reread project. Today we are continuing our reread of Prophs 2.0 with a Theon chapter. I almost forgot, I just looked at this. If you hear buzzing in the background, or just like in the background, not without the whistling noise, but that's the air conditioner in the other room. Again, I'm sure I can like remove that noise, but just in case. So let's jump right in. Oh, what's that? A necklace dangled from Rob's hand, the jewel set in its pendant glowing softly in the firelit room. He pulled the thing from his neck in a panic just a few seconds ago, and the strangest look went over his face. Theon hadn't even known he had it. I don't know, Rob told him. Bran gave it to me. He said that Arya found it in the Godswood. He removed the thing and stared at it. Bloody thing just burned me. How? I don't know. Rob frowned. I don't like it. He set it in his lap and then rubbed at his chest. He cursed under his breath. I don't like it a bit. Ooh, okay, that was weird. So this is actually kind of an interesting turn of events that Rob now has the necklace and it's affecting him too. Here's my thing. I feel like this necklace device could be interesting in a different story. I don't see why it needs to be in Prophs and what relevance it has to a fic based off of A Song of Ice and Fire. It feels like in a lot of these early stories, I was just picking a lot of different like devices and stuff and just throwing them on a wall and seeing what stick and what didn't. But it seems like everything I thought stuck, so it keeps all kinds of things. So that's why like this version of Prophs has like 7 different magical items in it when I don't even think that's a thing. Every once in a while in A Song of Ice and Fire, a person will claim to have a magical horn and you never know for sure if it's actually magical or not. Like, that's kind of how that goes. But here we've got like Arya's sword, which really should have come from Jon, is suddenly like a magical sword that just appeared in her thing. This necklace, we've got the little thing that she found by the river. We'll talk about that when we get to Arya's next chapter. But like, oh, and then the dagger comes off as kind of like a magical sort of thing, even though it's not. It was clearly just like a gift. But there's definitely some type of mythical significance with Jon having it. And it just seems like I was taking all kinds of different like fantasy ideas and throwing them at a wall in the story and seeing like, okay, so we can use this and this and this and this and this, but not really realizing that most of that stuff was really unnecessary. I will say it is interesting that Rob has the necklace and is affected by it. So it is like an interesting concept, but again, should have been a different story. Theon leaned back into his chair. It was a strange little thing, but it was put out of his mind by how empty the room seemed. Jon's absence had hung heavy between them for the last month or so. To see 3 turn to 2 after 18 years just felt odd. He couldn't help but wonder where the boy had gone and if he'd made it there. It'd been more than enough time for him to make it to the wall and beyond. He doubted that he would have gone south or east. He must have, because if he hadn't, they would have known. I guess. Then again, as we saw in Jon's chapter, Jon took a lot of pains to make sure that no one could find him. I'm actually kind of impressed. If I wasn't already just like, why are you doing this? I would be like, he's actually... And this is actually a trait that we've seen carry throughout the different versions of Prophs, because in Prophs 1.0, Jon very meticulously planned out his escape from the castle so that no one could hear him, and he got caught because someone heard him. He was just not careful that one little time, but he, for the most part, was very, very aware of the, like, things that would make noise, and he tried to avoid that stuff. I guess that's just, like, an interesting little tidbit about Jon that has survived through every single version. Moving on. He heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs and then a knock on the door. Rob beckoned them in, and it turned out to be Maester Luwin. He gave Rob a short bow. "My lord, the body of the wolf has arrived. The lady had her buried in the Godswood." Rob nodded. Good. "Oh, Kat's still here?" Whoa. The maester continued. "There have been reports from the Dreadfort of a dire wolf around the Weeping Water. They think it might be Ava?" Theon asked. "It may be," the maester said. "They don't know for sure. It never approached the castle." Theon smirked to himself. He couldn't blame it. Why does... Okay. It's hard to explain this because I don't remember the genesis of it, but it's really weird how the Boltons just keep getting their names kind of like thrown out there in every single version. And I promise you, this happens in almost every single version. And the one that it doesn't happen in, they are referenced, but it's very obliquely. I think what it has to do with is that over time, though this might have been an early on change, I really don't know what caused this, but over time, the Boltons sort of split into two families where there were the first Boltons who have like the majority of the history of the Boltons up to the last revolt that extinguished the Grey Starks and made the Boltons finally like kneel for the last time to the Starks. But then after this incident, then you have the Boltons that are called the Boltons, and they are a completely separate family who have always followed the Starks like loyally, but they do have a reputation for being kind of violent. And they were the ones who took out the old Boltons and the Grey Starks so that the Starks wouldn't have to sully themselves by kinslaying. And I don't know why this is a thing, but I feel like this has to be part of the reason why the Boltons keep getting brought up. Because if you think about like the version where the Boltons are actually tight with the Starks, it makes sense that they keep referencing the Boltons and making little like funny jokes about it. With, of course, like the thing in John's chapter where Roose Bolton literally just shows up in a village north of Last Hearth. I don't know why that happened, but the other little references to them sort of make sense when you look at it that way. So I'm assuming that's what's going on here. But again, I cannot for the life of me remember why it was a thing. Rob nodded again. Send Lord Bolton my thanks. The maester nodded and turned to Theon next. There's been a message for you, my lord. A request for your presence on Dragonstone. Theon grimaced. He never got messages. The maester pulled the scroll from his robes. It's from the Lady Melisandre. Who is that? Theon asked as he took the scroll. It was a small roll, the kind carried by Raven. It was wholly unremarkable, save that it was unsigned. She's a priestess of R'hllor who gives counsel to the Lord Baratheon. How do you know it's from her? The maester came and pointed to a corner of the paper which held a tiny mark, a black dot with a circle drawn around it. So like an atom. I thought he was of the seven, Rob said. He was, until she came, the maester told him. But what could she want with you? This is Rob saying that, I'm presuming. Theon shrugged. I don't know. Send a message back saying that I'm occupied. He rose and moved for the door. Where are you going? Rob asked him. The Godswood, he answered as he mounted the stairs. For what? Rob called up after him. To pray. Oh yeah, we're back. This is that chapter. Every single version of this, I swear, has a Theon goes to the Godswood chapter. Jesus. So again, I mentioned this, I think, in the Prophs 1.0 reread, but I do not remember where this plot point of Melisandre calling for Theon goes. I don't know why she's talking to him. I feel like at the time I just wanted every single character to cross over in some way, shape, or form. So I kind of just made up some type of plot point where Theon had to go to Dragonstone. It is really weird to me that it's Theon that keeps getting called to Dragonstone and not like John, a person whose family history has relevance to Dragonstone. Also, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this during this reread, but we are working off the assumption that R plus L equals J here, just so you know. Which, for those of you who don't know, is Rhaegar plus Lyanna equals Jon. This hasn't technically been confirmed in the books, but a lot of stuff in the books only makes sense if that is a thing, but it has been confirmed on the show. Anyway, it makes more sense for Jon to go to Dragonstone, but instead it was Theon. Like, again, I think I was just trying to make sure that all of the characters met each other for, like, the big showdown at the end for some reason. But anyway. He made his way back up the stairs and out to the Godswood, which stood as spectacular in night as it did in day. It was almost like the moon's meager gray light turned shining white when it hit the leaves there. Shadow joined him when he made it to the heart, the wolf black as the shadows he'd been named for. Again, that line comes off as really redundant when the name of the wolf is different, but anyway. His icy blue eyes shined in the moonlight. He kneeled down by the pool and the wolf sat next to him. He didn't know what he was doing there. He'd never prayed before or even taken any gods. Lord Stark told him about the old gods, and he'd seen Lady Catelyn at her sept sometimes. Trying to translate on the spot is hard. He knew nothing of the god of the Ironborn. Even so, he tried his luck with the old gods tonight. He didn't know what to do, so he just bowed his head and thought. Look after Jon, wherever he is, he thought. Let the wolf at the Weeping Water have been Ava, and let her come back here. Look after Lord Stark and Arya and Sansa. Don't let anything happen to them, please. The wind blew above him, whistling past the big trunk of the heart. His head popped up at the sound of a whisper. He looked up into the twisting branches of the tree, but he saw nothing but leaves that looked like shadows against the light. No, he thought, there was no one else there except Shadow and himself. He got to his feet and brushed the dirt from his pants. The sap from the bleeding tree left dark spots on the already black fabric and red stains on his hands. He turned for the gate when he noticed a large patch of dirt that looked freshly turned. As long as it was, he knew it was Lady. Shame she had to end the way she did, but better here than Lord Jamie's new floor rug. She was back where she belonged. He turned at the sound of footsteps and saw that Rob had come. Graywin wasn't at his side. "Oh, what's gotten into you?" he said to him. "It's not what's gotten into me so much as what's gotten away from me," Theon told him. "And what's gotten away from you?" Rob asked. "Everything, it seems." Rob smirked. "I know the feeling." His freckles looked brown in the night. "You're right not to go south now," he said. "Feels like they're killing wolves left and right." "I'm no Stark," Theon told him. "Your wolf's telling me otherwise, mate," Rob said. Theon shook his head. "Wolves are one thing. Names are another entirely." Rob shrugged. "If you say so." He pulled that necklace from his pocket and tossed it into the small pool of water. "What did you do that for?" "I put it back where they found it." He rubbed at his chest again as he turned for the gate. Maybe they should have left it there in the first place. Theon watched as the white light sank into the glassy blue water until it dimmed and finally disappeared. And that is the end of that chapter. So, that was actually kind of interesting. What I want to know is how all of the elements in the chapter kind of tie together. I feel like everything else in it kind of makes sense. The necklace is a little bit but I can look past that. The only thing that feels really off to me is the whole Melisandre thing, because I don't get it. Even though it does prompt a little nice bit of conversation between Rob and Theon, it just feels so out of nowhere and so random. And of course, because I don't remember what it was supposed to lead to, the why escapes me, so it feels really off. But yeah, that chapter wasn't bad. I feel like the Theon and the Godswood chapters have been getting better, even though the conversations for the most part have been the same. You notice that like every single time I write one of these, it has that same, it's not so much what's gotten into me as what's gotten away from me line, because I thought that was so clever. It's a nice line, I'm not gonna lie. But it wasn't bad. It definitely had like a nice feeling. I thought that all of Theon's feelings felt very like genuine, and it was a very revealing chapter for him. Definitely a lot better than some of the other Theon chapters we've been reading. But apparently that's a trend with him and Arya right now. I think it is also worth noting, and I don't know if this is something that I have talked about before. In prophs, Theon was brought to Winterfell as a baby instead of at 9 years old, because the Greyjoy Rebellion happened during Robert's Rebellion. Now, in the old versions, what actually happened, and I think that applies to this, is that Balon Greyjoy tried to rebel during the war, but it was like a small thing. It was more just like he was reaving the shores of the Westerlands. And because Tywin was sitting out the war in protest of the king, but not joining with the rebels until he thought that they were sure to win, he was there. So he chased them back to the Iron Islands, and then that's how Theon ended up in the custody of Ned after the war, because originally he was with Tywin, and then Tywin brought the baby to the capital so he could run the whole like I stopped the rebellion thing by Robert, because this literally happened like in the middle of the war. So he kind of just made the Iron Islanders swear fealty to him, and it's kind of like, you can't do that. So he went to go run that whole thing by Robert, and Robert was like, okay, that's cool, but this kid's gonna go with Ned, because having an Ironborn growing up in the West, that just doesn't seem right. And someday that he is gonna go home, hopefully. So if he ever does return home, him being up north is better than him having been in the West. That twist in the story makes a lot more sense in the newer version of prophs, but it was still sort of a thing back then. So in the old version, however, because in current prophs, that's where it ends. That was the Greyjoy Rebellion. It was a slightly bigger affair. But in the old versions, the proper big Greyjoy Rebellion then happened a few years later. And that was the one where Ned and Robert got in on it as well, and they like pushed him back to the Iron Islands and made him swear fealty and all this stuff. So that was originally how it went. After a while, I was just like, why do we need two Greyjoy rebellions? Just have the other one start up and then get stopped by Tywin. Done. But yeah, so it is important to know, just so Theon's little comment about seeing 3 turn to 2 after 18 years makes sense. But yeah, that chapter was fine. So moving on, we now have an Arya chapter. Her fork had barely touched her plate, and when it did, it only pushed around her vegetables. Her meat, which she normally would have died for, had gone cold and acquired a thin layer of grease across the top. Her stomach turned. She put her fork down again and moved for her cup of cider. Her father came into the hall late again. From the look of his face, he'd been arguing with the small council again. How many times are we going to say the word again here? Good Lord. It was nothing new. Most meetings he had with them were arguments from the day they'd set foot in King's Landing. It seemed they never said anything he wanted to hear. Jory and the other men of the guard stood as he entered, and he called for them to sit again once he reached the table. Surprise, they're in King's Landing already. I feel like parts like this really is where you feel the absence of a Sansa POV. There are two reasons why I feel like I skipped it. So the second one is because Sansa is visually impaired, and I feel like I was kind of afraid of taking on the challenge of writing someone who couldn't see. Though the degree to which Sansa is visually impaired changes depending on which version of prophs you're reading. In some of them, Sansa is legally blind, and then in other ones, she is completely blind. So it definitely shifts how much she can see. But either way, I feel like at this point, especially because these were written back in 2013, I wasn't super ready to take on that challenge yet. So I was just like, we can cover it with all the other kids, put Theon in, that'll give us another POV, blah, 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 you know. Other reason, which I think has a stronger case, is because later down the line, there is kind of not a twist with Sansa, but a development with Sansa that would reveal a lot of the story going forward. So keeping Sansa out as a POV kept that from being seen by the audience, first and foremost. And I think the reason why Sansa eventually did become a POV down the line is because I started to tamp down on that. But either way, Sansa's absence is really felt here because, like, we have no chapter detailing how they get to King's Landing. Because Ned and Cat don't have POVs, and neither does Tyrion, there are a lot of bits and pieces missing. So events kind of jump around quite a bit. Not at all helped by the fact that one of the fucking POV characters is literally north of the wall right now. So adding Sansa in, I feel like, would have been helpful for transitioning and also just adding some variety to the POVs so we don't have so many like chapters where it's like one character, like we keep jumping back to like the same character over and over again, you know. The story's been getting a lot better about that recently, but still. So moving on, speaking of Sansa. They say there will be a tourney, father, Sansa began. She sat on the other side of Septim Ordain, never even turning an eye on her sister. She can't see you. Why would she turn an eye on... What? I feel like sometimes past me is conspiring against me personally, like nowadays, by writing these Arya chapters. It's driving me nuts. They say knights will come from all over the realm to joust in your honor. There will, her father said, unfortunately. But can we go, father? I would love to go. Arya knew her sister loved the idea of that. It would be just like her stupid songs, but what did it matter to her? She wouldn't be able to see a thing. Right after you said that she never turned an eye on you, she can't see a thing. Like, I am so confused. I think I may have written that in because this chapter is based very heavily off of a book chapter. So maybe I put that in there, kind of paraphrasing George R. R. Martin and not really realizing that, you know, Sansa can't fucking see. But moving on. I don't know how much you would like a tourney, sweetling. There will be violence and bloodshed, things you wouldn't want to hear. The Septa stepped in then. My lord, Princess Marcella will be in attendance, and she is the same age as our Arya. All the ladies of the court will be expected, my lord, and it would seem strange if your daughters weren't present. Sansa gave a small smile, but Arya frowned. I assume the prince will be expecting our Lady Sansa as well. Sansa nodded fervently. Please, father, I have to go. I'm expected. It seems so, father sighed. I'll arrange a place for you two. I don't want to go, Arya said stubbornly. She didn't want to see the prince or the Kingslayer or any of the royal family if she could help it. I doubt you'll be wanted, Sansa said stiffly. Arya glared at her and opened her mouth to respond, but her father cut her off. I won't have fighting at the dinner table. Enough. Arya turned her eyes down at her plate. There was silence around her as she sipped lightly from her cup, and then a chair scratched against the floor. Excuse me, friends, I have a light appetite tonight. It stayed quiet as her father moved to the door. After it closed, however, the talk started back again. Sansa spoke excitedly with the Septa about the knights and princesses of her songs, and the men began about the joust and what knights would come. They spoke of names she'd heard and none she cared for. None of them spoke to her, but she didn't care. Men didn't talk to little girls, and she had no taste for songs and dainty tales. She wished sorely that her brothers were there, for John and Rob to muss her hair, and Bran to whisper the myths to, and even Theon Greyjoy to carry her off when she got too rowdy. I love that that's just like Theon's designated job, apparently, is just to pick up Arya and remove her from situations. Like, what? Oh, that's funny. She wished for her lowborn friends, but she hadn't seen the forger's children since they'd reached the capital, and they told her that Micah was never found. She always had a creeping feeling that they were lying and that something had happened to him. Now she only had Sansa, which was as good as no one at all. "And may I be excused?" she asked the Septa. The old woman turned on her, her hawk eyes looking pointedly at her plate. "You haven't touched your food, Arya. Clean your plate and you can go." Arya looked down at her plate again, the food now sticky and cold and gross. Her stomach turned, and it was enough to propel her from her seat and towards the door. The Septa called after her angrily, but she didn't stop. She ran and ran and ran until she reached the tower and then her room, slamming the door behind her. She flung herself to the floor and just laid there for a while, drinking in the quiet. She watched as the dust blew out in a small cloud when she sighed against the rug. This was the only place in all of the Red Keep that she liked because no one could mess with her here. Angry knocks sounded against the door. "Arya," the Septa said, "you come out this instant, young lady." "No," she shouted. "Go away. Your father will hear about this." "I don't care." She heard the Septa huff and the sound of receding footsteps. She got to her feet and then moved to her window seat. She lifted the top past the cushions to get to the trunk inside, then rifled through the books until she got to the bottom. Too many thes in that sentence. She placed the jewel she found on the river on her sword, finding that the little halo fit perfectly onto the bottom of the handle. Oddly, when she tried to remove it, it wouldn't budge. She didn't mind because it looked nice there against the silver. Still, she couldn't believe she'd come into something so fine. She thought it was just as fine as Rob's dagger, and even finer than the sword she'd thrown in the river. Okay, so this is what I was talking about before. The fact that the halo from Rhaegar's armor fits onto her magical sword implies that there is a connection there between the Targaryens, and I am failing to see what significance that has to Arya. In general, because I think the necklace also has a connection to the Targaryens because of the way that it like burns people, but if you were a Targaryen, it wouldn't like hurt you as much because they were quote unquote more resistant to burning. So there's again the implication, and again, I do not understand what significance it has to Arya and Bran. Like, the Targaryens don't mean much to them except as a source of like myths and stories, so I don't know, it's just really weird. Thinking of the river just made her sad. She wished she hadn't asked Micah to play swords. Then he would be wherever his father was instead of being lost or worse. Ava would still be here and Lady would still be alive. She felt a swell of anger towards the Kingslayer for ordering her death and the king for doing nothing about it. It's funny that in this one, Arya, instead of directing her anger at... Because we do see that she's angry at Joffrey, which makes sense, but it is noticeable that outside of, like, you know, a few side comments about, like, well, Sansa's not really my friend, she never once blamed Sansa for any of this, which was a kind of a big thing in both the show and the book. She blamed Sansa for not telling the truth about what happened. But it is interesting that most of her anger seems to be directed at Jaime and not at, like, her sister and her dad or anything like that. She stared out of her window, down on the castle's large red wall and the softly waving waters of the Blackwater Bay. Oh, God, so many of those. She wished she could leave, run away like Jon had. She could escape down the tower and through the city and leave forever. Foreshadowing. She could take her sword and her riding clothes, steal food, and escape back down the King's Road. She could find Ava at Derry and they could go home. Or she could stow away on a ship and travel back to the White Knife by the Blackwater and the sea. That would truly be an adventure. She could even stop on Dragonstone if she had to. She could see it out on the Blackwater, just a dark shadow in the night spotted with yellow lights. Oh, the Lord would be none the wiser. They said he never left his castle anyway. I'm not going to talk about possible distance discrepancy because whatever, she can see the Dragonstone from here, it doesn't matter. But this is the first mention that we've got of Stannis and the fact that he quote-unquote never leaves his castle. This is a common thing throughout a lot of different versions of prophs, that Stannis is kind of like a hermit for some reason, but we never learn what reason in any of the written versions. But moving on. She looked up at the sound of another knock on the door. "Arya," her father said, "I need to speak to you." She hastily threw the sword back into the window seat, then moved and unlocked the door. Thankfully, her father was alone, but she didn't like the look on his face. He came and closed the door behind him. She suddenly wished that she had cleaned a bit, but her father never much cared. That was what her mother would go on about, and the septa. The thought of the septa made her angry again. Why do I have to have a septa anyway? She asked her father. I don't even keep the 7. Is that so? He said as he sat on her bed. She climbed up beside him. You are a Stark, that much is true. We've given you a septa to help you become a respectable lady, though you're making it very hard for her. I don't want to be a lady, she spat. All she could do was play the harp, and what would that do for her? I'm really leaning on this harp thing. How is that supposed to come in handy? I feel like there must have been some sequence where she ends up in someone's, like, castle and plays the harp. Or maybe when she's on the run, she pretends to be, like, a musician or something like that with someone or other, but I don't remember any of those details, really. But it must be something. You remind me too much of my sister, Sweetling, he said sadly. She had a wildness about her, she did. She would have carried a sword if she could. Something about that resonated with her. Would you let me carry a sword, Papa? I could use one. A sword is no toy for a girl, even one as fierce as you, he told her. I know you're not your sister, but you'd still be a fine lady. You'll marry a lord and your sons will be knights and fierce warriors. She didn't like the idea of that a bit. I don't want that, she said, looking down. I want my own sword in my own castle where no one can get me, not the king or the prince or the kingslayer or even Sansa. Arya, her father said, you're to call him Lord Jaime and that's all. Do you hear me? I hate him, she said, smoldering. I hate them all. Father got down on his knees so that they sat face to face. Listen to me. This isn't Winterfell, child. This isn't home. This isn't a place for willfulness and childish tantrums. I don't mean to scare you, but there are people here that mean us harm. The septa means only to help, and Sansa is your sister. If you must hate, hate those who would hurt us, not your family, and not our friends. God's help me if something happened to either of you. I'm sorry, she said, flinging her arms around his neck. I don't really hate Sansa or the septa. I know, Sweetling. He placed a kiss on her forehead and rose and moved for the door. Before he left, he turned back. And Arya, apologize to Mordain, please. She nodded, and he closed the door behind him. She hopped from her bed back to the window and pulled out her sword again. She couldn't think to give it up. Maybe one day it would be her own ancestral sword, and she'd pass it to her daughter, like her family did with Ice. Comforted by that, she dug back into the trunk and put the sword back where it had been. The sight of a little white light brought a swell to her heart. And that is the end of that chapter. Overall, chapter is fine. However, I do think that this chapter does a really good job of encapsulating why I tended to change the POVs on certain situations. Because that was literally just that same Arya chapter from the book, but paraphrased. Which is why it's fine, but it's not anything special. Because, like I said, there are some times when chapters follow book content and I don't care. In this case, that doesn't work. And I definitely think that this probably should have been a Sansa chapter instead or something like that. That said, I have noticed that this melds some things from a different Arya chapter into it. The line about her sons being like lords and knights and her husband being a lord, that comes from a different Ned chapter. Or not a different Arya chapter, but it comes from a Ned chapter. And it's that scene in the show and the books where Arya is balancing on her toes and Ned finds her and kind of talks to her about that stuff after he gets the book or whatever, I think. Something like that. So it is interesting that that's brought up here. However, it does make sense because in this version of the story, Syrio isn't a thing because Arya never shows her dad the sword, as we can see. So that's not like a super important nail, but it is a nail technically. But yeah, that chapter was fine. I feel like it could have had potential, but instead, like for what it is, it's passable. So we're going to read one more chapter because this episode's running a lot longer than I thought it would. This next chapter is a Bran chapter. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Leaving? Bran asked, scared and confused. Why? My child, his mother said, taking his face in her hands, I have to inform your father of the dangers presented to him in the south. It's my duty as his lady wife. But he didn't understand. Why she had to go herself. They had a whole guard of men they trusted. Why did she have to go too? Mother pulled her wool cloak around her shoulders as she straightened. Sir Roderick handed her her gloves. Your brother is here, Bran, she told him. You're not alone. It's worth noting that I guess I just never renamed Sir Roderick. So Sir Roderick's name, and this was something that was in Prophs 1.0 too. His name is literally just 2 asterisks, which is really sad. This poor man never has a name. But moving on. But he wanted to hear none of that. He pushed back past his brother and Theon and ran for the stairs. He heard his mother sigh as he left. Why did everyone have to leave? Why was everyone leaving? There was nothing in the south but danger. He knew that. Maybe Mother should go south, he thought as he stomped up to his room. Then she could drag Father and his sisters back where they belong. That's not supposed to be funny, but it is. He shut the door hard behind him and flung himself onto the bed. The castle seemed to become emptier by the day. He thought Theon was the only person with any sense, rightfully declining all those letters asking him to go down. He knew what was there. Mother wouldn't tell him what she wanted to tell Father. He was, quote-unquote, too young to hear. He had almost been tempted to tell her what had happened to him, but he was too scared. He was ashamed of being scared. There was no one here that could hurt him, not anymore, but sometimes he thought there was. He was glad he hadn't gone south. There'd be nothing but danger for him there. I keep hearing Bran say, I keep feeling like I'm in danger here, but that assassination attempt hasn't happened yet. Or I don't think it is going to happen because Bran didn't fall from the tower. The whole point of that was in the books. Joffrey is the one who sent the assassin with his dad's dagger to go and kill Bran because he heard Robert talking about, oh, it'll be a mercy. So he thought, oh, I'll impress my dad by doing this. Which apparently there are some people who haven't figured that out yet. Spoilers, I guess. But here, that straight up hasn't happened. And more importantly, if it did happen, Joffrey wouldn't have done it. It probably would have been Jaime. So I'm surprised. Unless I forgot something. As far as I can remember in this version, there has been no assassination attempt. So that's interesting. But I guess that also kind of makes sense. Like, but anyway. He was hit with an idea and moved for the door, and the door met him with a knock. He opened it to find his brother and Theon. Rob moved to the bed, but Theon stayed by the door. Is that symbolic? Anyway, we need to talk, Rob told him. He sighed. The last thing he wanted to do was talk. Things haven't been right since Father left. I know you haven't told Mother everything. Something's wrong. Everyone is leaving, he told him, and it was true, but not every truth. He still couldn't bring himself to say it. Every truth. That's a weird line. It seemed that his brother could tell. People have to leave home sometimes, Bran. It'd be impossible to stay in the castle and only this castle forever. Though you've been making a bloody good try at it, Theon chuckled. You haven't left the castle properly in almost 2 months, Rob pressed. There's something else. I know there is. He actually tried then. He really did. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. Rob was his brother. He should be able to tell him anything. But all that came out eventually was, I can't say it. Why not? Rob asked him. He could only shake his head. Rob gave Theon a look. Mother can't go south, Bran finally said. The Kingslayer is there. He slapped his hand over his mouth. He hadn't meant to call him that. Rob raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? You think Lord Jaime wants to hurt Mother or Father? Bran nodded. You don't have to worry about him. Oh, God. This Theon line bothers me, but whatever. He's just a pretty boy in velvet gloves, Theon scoffed. Needn't be scared of that bloke. It was easy for them to say, Bran thought, but they hadn't been through what he had. Even so, he nodded for them. You need to get out of the castle, Rob said. We're going riding tomorrow. I want you to go. Bran sighed heavily. All right, then. He was quiet for a moment and then said, I want to go to the Godswood. Rob nodded his consent and then added, take your wolf with you. So let me pause there real quick. This is the second time I've seen a line that has a very sort of British feel to it. I know I was doing it on purpose because I really wanted these characters to sound a specific way, but I feel like I was kind of laying it on thick. Sorry, didn't mean to do all that, mate. And then this Theon line, there are multiple, in the use of the word bloody, every other chapter, it is very, kind of laying it on. These people are supposed to be fake British. Did you know that? To be honest, something that I was kind of into back in the day was really establishing speaking patterns for people and stuff to indicate where they were from. I will say this story, despite it being a little heavy-handed, does a much better job of it than I feel like the Batman stories did, because it was something I was really concerned about in Batman. I'm I want characters from different places to sound different, and I want these characters to have speech patterns that indicate their backgrounds and all this other stuff. But the only characters who really sound different from most of the main characters are the characters who aren't from Gotham City or even America. I'm not going to get into this because this isn't a Batman review, but this story does actually at least try to add in some different word usages and different words and stuff, but it still feels a little bit hokey. But moving on. The sky was covered in a fine layer of gray clouds, and the filtered light of the sun turned white as it touched the wood. He wove through the pines and sentinels until he reached the heart. He sat cross-legged at the edge of the pool, and his wolf lied down next to him. He didn't particularly want to pray. He just wanted to sit in the quiet. The thoughts of that day still pained him greatly, even though it had been months. His father's words echoed in the back of his head. The sooner you see, the better you'll know, and the easier you will eventually go. Oh, bars. He'd seen, of course, but it wasn't until that day that he knew. With the way he'd clung to the ivy that climbed the walls of the burn tower, he wondered how easy he would go. Maybe it wasn't so simple. Interesting. He pushed the thoughts of it out of his mind, not wanting to think of that anymore. His wolf shifted and laid its head on his lap. Aw. It only just occurred to him that he'd never named him. He was nearly full grown, and he had no name. Unfortunately, he still couldn't think of anything. Something had to come to him, eventually. The wind blew past him, cold and brisk and mussing his hair. A shiver ran through him, and he pulled his cloak close around him, hoping the wool would warm to his body. The path of the sun was starting to lean in the sky, and the days were growing shorter. It looked like the seasons were going to change at last. He'd never known winter. The last had ended before even Sansa was born, and he didn't know if he wanted to. Oh, that's a change. Because in the books and in current props, the last winter ended the year Bran was born. Interesting. It seemed he would have to change, however. The direwolf wasn't a creature of summer, and the Starks were known as the men of winter. He could keep something of it, though, just a memory, the way others used pictures and trinkets. Summer, he said as he stroked his wolf's head. I'll call you Summer. And that's the end of that chapter. I really like that. Wow, that was actually really good. I will say I feel like content-wise, this sort of retreaded on that Bran chapter where his mom was trying to get him to leave the castle earlier in the story, and he was like, no, and kind of had like a breakdown and then ran into Arya's room. And that's where he found the necklace. That's how the necklace ended up still being at Winterfell until Robb threw it in the water. But I don't think the content that was discussed there was exactly the same. It just broached the same topic of Bran, like, thinking back to the execution and then thinking back to whatever happened to him on the burn tower, and comparing the two things. Like, his dad being like, seeing this will help you die easier, but the fact that he very much did not want to die when he was faced with death just a month later, you know? But outside of that, which I don't even think is really a problem because, again, it broached the same topic, but it didn't do it in exactly the same way, I think. It was more brief here. I think the other one was a little more in-depth and talked about it differently. But this chapter was good. Like, it was really good. I really liked that. I don't really have anything else, like any other criticisms. It was fine. Not any criticisms, like general criticisms that I haven't lobbied at other chapters. That was a really nice character chapter for Bran. Okay, so I lied. We are going to read one more chapter because there's a little bit more time before this hits an hour, and I don't mind going a little bit over. So this next and last chapter is a Jon chapter. It seemed like they'd been wandering through the forest for ages. He had no idea how they knew where they were going, or if they truly knew. Even more, he still didn't know where they were going. Neither Alice nor Ygritte would tell him where they were headed, and if he was honest, he wasn't sure they actually knew. Samwell knew nothing either, though that was because he was a hostage. Oh, plot twist. They spent day after day winding their way through thickets of dark pines and iron sentinels, never able to stop for too long for fear that they might get eaten. The infinite maze of trees made for a disorienting traveling experience, but as far as he knew, they weren't going in circles. As far as I know, he thought to himself, but how much do I know? Nothing, Jon Snow. Jon was a stranger to forest dwelling, and his new compatriots weren't keen on helping him. He forced himself to take some comfort in the fact that Sam was even more helpless than he was. The boy had been forced to the Shadow Tower from the Reach, and he was too new to have gained any skills that would help him this far beyond the wall. He talked quite a bit, but he didn't mind with the oppressing quiet of the forest. What's it like in the north? Like where you're from? Sam asked as he climbed through the brush. Jon shrugged. Gray mostly, a bit cold. A smile broke out over Sam's face. Why? I don't know. It's just that in the south, no one ever sees any of you, he said. I never met a northerner until I was sent to the wall, and I definitely never met a wildling until I met her, he said, indicating Ygritte. Don't call me that, she spat back at them. He saw Alice glare back at him. Wild, Ygritte scoffed. We ain't wild. He and Sam looked at each other, but neither of them spoke. Rude. Rude. Also, remember how that line was in Prophs 1.0? That definitely came from one of Jon's chapters in a previous version of Prophs. All he'd heard about the wildings, he didn't know what else to call them, came from the stories, but he tried his best not to project the caricatures his people made of them onto Ygritte. She could be loud and raucous, but the girl was fierce as a lion, and he knew better than to cross her. He didn't expect less of any other wilding they might meet along the way, and he wasn't exactly looking forward to them. But my father had said that there hadn't been any northerners in the south since King Robert won the crown, Sam continued after a moment. They say the craziest things about you all down there. They say that it's so cold that it freezes the laughter in a man's throat, and that's why the Starks have no humor. He chuckled. When I came up here, I saw why. Summer's not even over, and it was freezing before we reached the wall. They tell us it never snows in the south, John said. Oh, that's true, Sam said, at least where I'm from. It rained a lot. Sometimes the dungeons in my father's castle would flood in the low summer when the rains got really bad. It never got as bad as it did in the Stormlands, though. That's really interesting because Sam's dad's castle is in the mountains. If they're flooding, what kind of fucking rainstorms are they having down there? Damn. John's head popped up when he heard Ghost let out a yip, but when he looked, the wolf just looked back at him, his red eyes glowing in the low light. He continued on his way. You said your father is a lord, right? Yes. Then why did he send you north? He asked. Sam went a bit red. I'm sorry. No, it's fine, Sam said, wiping his brow. He stuttered a bit when he started. My father didn't think I was Lord Material, you know. I'm not one for fighting and those kinds of things. My father wasn't one of those guys that would pass the sword to my sister, and he wouldn't let me go off and be a maester. So, when I became of age, he told me that I had to take arms, or... He bit his lip. Well, he told me I could choose which tower, at the least. He shrugged. I'm sure you can see why I did what I did despite my, shortcomings. John nodded. Your dad's a lord too, isn't he? John nodded again. Then why did he send you north? He didn't, he told him. I sent myself. Why in the world would you do that? Sam asked. Who would come up here if they didn't have to? Who said I didn't have to? There was silence between them. So let's pause there. Number one. Very ominous. We never learned why John ran away in this one. Oh my god, except that he's had bad feelings at the castle and he doesn't want to go back for a while. But Sam's story was paraphrased very differently. The speech patterns, it's very modern, which is weird because, then you look at the way, Ned speaks in that Arya chapter, and it's very much just like the text from the book. That's interesting. Maybe they have a more modern way of speaking in the Reach. I don't know. But that was really interesting because it seems like something that it sounds like would come out of my mouth, not something from Samwell Tarly, you know? Anyway, let's move on. How did three highborns end up tracing through the forest north of the wall? Sam asked absently. John couldn't help but agree, to a point. He wondered how Alice had gotten herself up here, but when he asked, the answer she gave him was a glare. It seemed like all she ever did was glare, really. Her soft, heart-shaped face hid what seemed to be a soul of stone. John stopped again when he heard something rustle in the brush. The others seemed to have heard it as well. A flash of red told him it was Ghost again. "It's me, boy," he said in the dark, and the wolf eventually came, carrying something in his mouth. I did want to pause real quick and note that I have no idea why Alice is north of the wall right now, because if you've read the books, you know that Alice Karstark left Karhold to escape her uncle because her uncle was trying to take her inheritance because I think her brother had died, something like that, so she was next in line, and her uncle was trying to marry her forcibly so he could inherit Karhold. However, without that specific circumstance, which only happens because of the war, I have no idea why Alice is north here, and I don't think it ever gets explained before this ends, because next episode is the last episode, and there isn't another John chapter. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, but moving on. What's that? Alice said. She tried to take it from him, but Ghost pulled back. Give it here, boy, John said. He dropped it in his hand. It was an extremely thin piece of glass that looked like it was covered in cracks and filled with intrusions, but felt absolutely smooth. Why do I always put the word absolutely in there where it doesn't belong? The jagged edges were incredibly sharp. Is that dragon glass? Alice asked. John shook his head. It's too thin. No one would forge it this thin. But what in the world is that doing up here? Sam asked. That was a question none of them could answer. And that's the end of that chapter. This chapter is okay. I always have mixed feelings about this one because I used to read it and get this distinct feeling that, the characters, I didn't know what I wanted them to do, so they were just kind of walking around in circles. But reading it this time, I didn't get that feeling. I understand why I felt that way because the chapter literally begins with John saying, I don't know where we're going, I don't know why we're going to this place, and I don't know if the people I'm following know where they're going either. However, this chapter does have a clear purpose because we get like lots of Sam's backstory. These two characters start to bond, which is important. And then the weird, like, is it dragon glass or not thing happens at the end, which is clearly a thing that's going to get picked up in the next chapter or down the line. It's important for something. I don't know what. I think this is another one of those throwing magical things at the wall and everything sticks moments, but I can't say that for sure because I don't remember this plot. But overall, this chapter, it didn't bother me. It didn't feel pointless. It felt like this was stuff that it was important to learn about the characters because it's setting up Sam and him and John relating to each other. And that might be, important later if something happens where they decide maybe they're going to try and turn on these girls, or maybe that their bonding moments were going to come later or something like that, and the group was going to get tighter. I don't know. So overall, I definitely feel like this definitely could have played a role in the story. I don't know what role, but it felt like it had a purpose. So I don't think that was that bad. Overall, the majority of the chapters we read this episode were actually pretty good. It feels like there was a weird quality bump between the back and forth between the Arya and Theon chapters and that one Bran chapter, which wasn't bad, and the stuff that we started reading last episode. I don't know. The only chapter that really bothered me was the Arya one, and it wasn't bad. It just felt like it was uninspired. But everything else was actually really good. Like, I'm surprised at how much I'm actually engaged in the story. So that's good. So next episode we will be beginning with a Theon chapter, I think. So I will see you for that. Like I said, next episode is the last episode of this because there's only 3 chapters left. It's Theon, Arya, and then part of a Bran chapter. If you like this video, don't forget to like it on the YouTubes and then subscribe and watch other videos. Maybe watch Prophs 1.0. I don't know when you're watching this. Maybe you can keep watching the entire Prophs series. Watch some ones that don't have to do with Prophs. Maybe ones from stories that came out around the same time. I don't know. Maybe you'll get something out of that. But like I said, I'll see you next episode. Bye!